last-minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning, Ryan. It's okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always as
Thanks,
simple as
Ryan.
1,
What's
2,
up?
3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
What's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
You're listening to the Peak Physique Podcast with Andre Adams on the NASM Podcast Network.
Hey guys, welcome back to another exciting episode of the NASM Peak Physique Podcast. I'm your host, Andre Adams, IFBB Physique Olympian and NASM Master Trainer. And today we are going to be breaking down what inflammation markers you should be aware of and monitoring on prep. And this applies to not just physique athletes, but all of you guys that are training hard and you're constantly putting that high amount of stress and stimulus on the body. This applies to you as well. In this episode, I'm going to break down which inflammation biomarkers to watch out for, especially during prep, how they can impact your health and ultimately your physique outcomes. We'll also talk about why bodybuilders specifically might be more susceptible to inflammatory response, what the impacts of PED usage can have on, a physique athlete, and then what those common tests and management strategies to reduce the overall amount of inflammation in the body. Let's dive right in here and talk about why is managing inflammation during prep even important, right? You're going to get some mixed feedback if you think about it. The inflammation response, the body's response to any kind of stress or illness, can actually be a good thing in some scenarios, right? When we're trying to build muscle and we're training in a hypertrophy phase, we're creating some exercise-induced muscle trauma, muscle damage, and that inflammation process is actually what heals and ultimately repairs and grows muscle tissue. Similarly, if you're familiar with things like, PRP, which would be like the platelet-rich plasma injections for healing joints, shoulders, knees, those are pro-inflammatory, very painful, but that inflammation, again, can come in and actually repair damaged tissue. So, there is a certain role that inflammation plays in the body, but managing it and whether it's acute or chronic and what the cause is can severely impact the physique outcome. It's critical for proper recovery and also to avoid burnout. And inflammation, obviously, again, necessary for healing the body, and it's really your immune system's response to that stimuli or infection, or it could be a medical disorder that's driving it. So we want to hopefully delineate, is this a medical condition or is this something that's exercise induced that we can manage? Next, let's dive into common symptoms, right? How do I identify if I have inflammation, and more specifically acute versus chronic inflammation, and what signs to look for? For chronic inflammation, we're talking about things like that chronic fatigue feeling, chronically swollen or puffiness, a lot of extracellular water retention, could be excessive amounts of muscle soreness for extended periods of time. And some of those symptoms, again, can be triggered by different external stressors. It could be actual psychological stress, physiological stress, but those are some of the most common signs, I would say, is, if you have that muscle soreness, DOMS, we'll call it also, right? Delayed onset muscle soreness. If you've got just a constant amount of bloating and water retention, this could be a good indicator that you're carrying excessive amounts of inflammation. Now, these are just kind of the visual or external things that we can look for, but further into the podcast, we're going to dive in more specifically, how can we test for these things through things like blood work and HTMA testing and so forth. Talking about what the most common causes of chronic inflammation is or are in physique athletes, I think is also important, right? What are the main drivers that contribute to high amounts of inflammation, and what can we do to manage those? one of the first things that comes to mind for any physique athlete is the potential for overtraining. Now, this is a topic that's highly debated, right? You're going to hear different perspectives on this all over the place, that some people disagree and say there's no such thing as overtraining, right? The body adapts over time, right? GAS, general adaptation syndrome, to the amount of stimulus that we're putting on the muscle, and eventually your body will adapt to that stimulus. Now, that being said, overtraining without proper recovery periods, without proper nutrition, without proper hydration and sleep can cause a lot of chronic inflammation, right? So you're going to get some exercise-induced muscle damage. Now, immediately following a very difficult training session, let's say it's leg day and you've just completed 25 to 30 sets of very challenging leg exercises and compound movements, some isolated exercises, you're definitely going to have some inflammation. I would hope you do, right? This is how we get to that hypertrophy level and start to recover and build the muscle tissue. Now, again, if your recovery is on point, that might not be an issue for you 48 hours, 72 hours after that difficult training. But over the course of an entire prep, when we're talking 12, 16, 20, sometimes 22, 24 weeks of prep, this can have a compounding effect, right? So that's really what we're trying to get at, is when we have this acute inflammation that potentially turns into or builds up to more chronic inflammation over time, how can we best manage that? And one of the things that I would recommend, obviously, would be scheduling regular deloads or some undulating periodization, which in a subsequent episode, we're going to talk about how to set up your programming to include things like the deload. Now, another cause could be on prep, especially during the core cutting phases. We're at a very low caloric intake compared to baseline or maintenance, very low compared to an improvement or growth phase. So having that caloric restriction, right, it doesn't lend itself as well to support recovery. So recovery is going to be at its lowest at the end of a prep. Lowest amount of caloric intake, typically highest amount of external inputs and training volumes, right? Cardio. So this can, again, be a stress response that the body is having to these high amounts of input with not enough, calories or micronutrition to support that recovery period. Another thing that could be driving inflammation in some individuals is histamine intolerance, right? We're going to talk more about that specifically in a moment, but just start thinking about histamine intolerance, gluten intolerance, right? If you have any issues with wheat, especially if you have a more severe medical condition like celiac disease, and then even supplementation, right? It could be your over-the-counter nutraceuticals, vitamins, minerals. It could be a response to some AAS, androgenic anabolic steroid use. A lot of these things can trigger inflammation in the physique athlete. Another potential driver is we'll call it immune system dysregulation, right? So this could be due to fighting off infection, and maybe you're mistaking that inflammation as something that's exercise induced. In reality, really just fighting off something in the body, right? Bacterial or viral type of infection, a pathogen. And then again, just touching back on the diet, other things are simple sugars, especially processed sugars, will definitely cause inflammation. So for all you guys that love your cheat meals, and you go out on that Saturday night, you're out with friends, and coach gives you a 1,200 calorie, 1,500 calorie cheat meal. Maybe you had a drink of alcohol. All of these things are going to be potential triggers for inflammation in the body. Now, those would be more of an acute response. And these are things that we can measure, but oftentimes you don't need to measure it. You can feel the puffiness and the water retention, visibly see it. You can hop on the scale and see that the scale's up, right? We're holding a bit of water. High aldosterone levels, high amounts of stress, saturated fats from fast food. All these are potential drivers that not only physique athletes, but any individual could experience. Now that we've covered some of those basic things that maybe are driving the inflammation, I want to talk more about potential PED and anabolic androgenic steroid use because of how common it has become. Again, we don't promote or condone the use of any supplementation. However, I think it's very important for the physique athlete and coach to be aware of potential effects, because the reality is this is the world we live in, and we need to be knowledgeable about these things rather than relying on the pseudoscience, right, that's kind of out there in the industry. So AAS can definitely cause excessive amounts of oxidative stress. It can cause fluid retention and higher amounts of total blood volume, right? So you'll see hemoglobin, hematocrit, you'll see RBC or red blood cell count tend to elevate over time. A lot of times B12 is high, which is also increasing the amount of RBC production, which can cause high blood pressure. And then just, again, more fluid retention and overall inflammation in the body. Now, the interesting thing about this is medications such as corticosteroids, let's take prednisone, for instance, can actually have the opposite effect, right? They can actually help reduce inflammation, so anti-inflammatory response. And this is probably confusing for some people, but in certain dosages, corticosteroids actually reduce inflammation and help to heal the tissues faster in the body. So just understanding some of the mechanisms of actions of how these different types of supplements and drugs can interact with the body, very important for not only predicting a physique outcome, but just optimizing overall health and managing inflammation and stress on the body. Guys, if you're just joining us, we are on the Peak Physique Podcast, and we're talking about managing inflammation and what biomarkers to look for on prep. Let's keep going here, right? We're talking about biomarkers. Let's talk about which ones that you should be monitoring. What type of testing can you take? And, blood work versus HTMA, hair tissue mineral analysis. What's going to be your best bet to monitor these things and really just help regulate them during contest prep? Although there are many inflammatory markers, we also refer to these as, acute phase reactants. They're most commonly measured actually in clinical practice. I would say the most common would be CRP, right? That's your C-reactive protein. So anytime you do your blood draws and you need updated blood work, make sure that you're adding on the CRP, C-reactive protein lab test. Other good ones that can be used, especially in those clinical practices, would be like ESR or PCT, right? Those two, and I would even add in plasma viscosity, right? So the PV test. Each of these can be leveraged to give some insights on different inflammatory responses that are happening throughout the body. Again, the most common that I would say that we typically monitor for physique athletes is going to be that CRP, C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory protein that can be measured to determine the amount of inflammation in the body. Higher levels of CRP are found in your blood directly after a workout, which we talked about a moment ago. And that can persist for, 1 to 2, up to 3 days, depending on the amount of exercise-induced muscle damage and your ability to recover that muscle. Now, again, your body can and normally will lower CRP levels over time, but that process can take, anywhere from 1 to 3 days typically. During that time, that's really when we're seeing the muscle growth and the repair process happening. You guys have probably heard me talk about the SRA curve in the past, right? Stimulus, recovery, adaptation. We're applying a great enough stimulus to cause a reaction, and that reaction in turn causes a muscle adaptation. And then over the subsequent 24 to 72 hours, we get the, recovery adaptation where we're building the muscle back to higher than homeostasis levels. And again, that's part of that process. CRP plays a big role in that inflammation and healing process, but excessive amounts of CRP over extended periods of time is something that we need to manage, right? Because you're not going to feel great when you're chronically inflamed. And for a physique athlete, if you're constantly holding water and you're puffy, it can also be counterproductive to your physique outcomes. And this is probably a good segue I'm going to give you guys a quick tidbit of pro information, pro advice. When you're nearing the end of your contest prep, immune system's at its lowest, ability to recovery is at its lowest, calories are usually somewhere near their lowest. Sometimes we do reload going into the show, but best practice for peak week to manage inflammation is lowering your amount of stress inputs. So less cardio, that should be starting to taper off, 7 to 10 days out. Less intensity in the gym. So we're intentionally not trying to encourage DOMS or delayed onset muscle soreness. we're trying not to have excessive amounts of exercise-induced muscle damage or trauma. We're trying to just focus mostly on pump, blood flow, circulation, pushing those nutrients, carbohydrates into the muscles, right? And really managing inflammation. So less inputs. And then if you're already fat-free and stage lean 1 to 2 weeks out, now as we lower those inputs, we can start to slowly build those calories back up to maintenance, which we would call that a linear reload going into the show. So lowering total inflammation and then bringing the calories back up to support recovery, which further lowers inflammation and will have a better outcome for your physique. One question I get pretty often on this topic too is how frequently should I be doing these blood tests, right? So going back to the CRP or ESR, any of these kind of tests, for me, it's one of those, if everything's in a good spot at the beginning of prep, just figure every 2 to 3 months is usually good enough, unless you have something acute that's happening, right? If there's a very sharp turn in your physique or your health, the way that you're feeling, your energy, your inflammation, then I would highly recommend scheduling another blood lab and look at your hormone panels, look at your CBC with differential, your blood work, and then obviously start looking at inflammatory response. Make sure there's nothing out of the norm happening there. Now, if we're trying to specifically monitor 1 or 2 of these values, you might want to retest it every 4 to 6 weeks, right? It just depends on the cause and then what we're trying to monitor. But just figure bare minimum 2 to 3 months, like I say 90 days at the longest. And then for things that we need to closely monitor, tighten that up to every 4 to 6 weeks or so as needed. And then I'll leave you guys with some general recommendations for how can we manage and lower inflammation and ultimately boost our recovery. I threw some tips at you for peak week. Those strategies can be used also during like deloads. And that's one thing I want to talk about is scheduling regular deload periods. I don't see this enough. I don't think it's as common of practice as it should be. But if you've been training hard and putting this high amount of stress and strain on the body for 6 to 8 weeks at a time, you need to be scheduling in a deload week. Now, the deload week can serve many, different purposes. One of them, obviously, to manage and reduce inflammation in the body. But in addition to that, for your mental health and wellness, especially athletes that are trying to avoid the burnout, both physically and mentally, it's good to schedule these deload weeks. And you could do a 5-day deload. It could be a 7-day deload. But what we're talking about, what we're describing here, similar to my approach for peak weeks, is lowering the amount of inputs. So if you're normally doing 6 days of 60 minutes cardio in the morning, you're doing your full training sometime in the afternoon, and then you're doing post-workout or evening cardio, you want to scale that back to about 50%. Bring yourself back down to about maintenance, right? So maybe it's 3 days of fasted cardio, and it's just walking, right? Low impact, low inflammatory. We would then also look at your training and say, instead of training 5 to 6 days this week, on your deload week, you're going to do maybe 3 lighter workouts, about 75% intensity, focus on prioritizing sleep, and then start implementing some of those recovery strategies, which I'll go a little deeper to in a moment, but things like Epsom salt baths, infrared sauna, or contrast therapy, and just really taking that full week to deload the body from this excessive amount of physical stress and strain we're placing on the body. Simultaneously, we want to promote recovery by increasing macronutrition. So calories during this period would come up to maintenance for a little bit. And then we would also, look at what micronutrition and supplementation can we take. Things like L-glutamine, maybe it's a little bit of extra creatine, electrolytes for hydration, right? Betaine for muscle cell hydration, things like this that will help to promote recovery and lower inflammation in the body. Another one of my favorites, if you guys follow me on Instagram on my own prep journey, right now I'm sitting actually less than 4 weeks, about 3.5 weeks out from the Kazakhstan Invictus Pro Show. And managing the stress going on 40 years old is very, very important, right? My body doesn't recover as fast as it did 15 years ago. So IV drip therapies are something that I've actually implemented bi-weekly during this entire 20-week prep. And, looking at vitamins, and minerals and hydration and things that are going to support detoxification, rejuvenation, and then obviously lowering the inflammation. Very, very critical. And IV drip therapy is one of the fastest and most efficient ways to do that. So highly recommend that. Another one of my favorites is contrast therapy. So that's going to be, going from hot to cold and shocking that parasympathetic nervous system, which actually is in charge of the relaxation, so rest and relaxation, right? Versus your sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight. That's cortisol, that's anxiety, that's stress, right? We want to relax the body. So shocking the parasympathetic nervous system. One thing that I implement personally for myself and my athletes is going from infrared sauna. I'll go around 135 degrees for, let's say, 20 minutes in the evening, and then go directly from there into a cold plunge. If you don't have access to a cold plunge, you could do a very cold shower. But shocking the body, shocking that parasympathetic is certainly going to help lower the inflammation response in the body. So you don't want to do it maybe like immediately after training because you want the inflammation, but you do want to try and squeeze that in a couple times a week when possible. More sleep, so prioritizing more sleep, and not just sleep, but quality sleep, right? Are you hitting those deep stages of sleep? Are you hitting those REM stages and really getting the most out of your recovery? 7 to 8 hours, if possible. So really focusing on, maybe you need to make some lifestyle changes. Maybe it's, different vitamins and minerals or melatonin, things that will help you unwind in the evenings. Magnesium is another great support. 5-HTP and GABA, another great sleep support. These are things that can help you get better quality sleep to promote recovery and reduce inflammation. Eating more antioxidant rich foods. So this can help lower stress, definitely on the body. And then also actual physical or external stress, right? Think about making any lifestyle changes you need to lower the amount of total stress, lifestyle, or training stimulus that's being placed on the body. Some good nutritional therapies or supplements and foods that I'll recommend. Tart cherry juice, believe it or not, can actually have some very, very potent anti-inflammatory effects. A variety of fruits and veggies, right? Getting those phytonutrients in, antioxidants in. And I always encourage, just for general gut health and balance anyways, a variety of different color fruits and veggies. Nuts and seeds, especially ones that are high in omega-3. So if you actually have a diet that's too high in omega-6 and too low in omega-3, this high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio can actually contribute to inflammation. So we want to make sure that we're really getting in those omega-3s and balancing out our inflammation. Turmeric is another great one, right? That contains an ingredient called curcumin, which has also been shown to reduce inflammation naturally. So again, just looking at nutraceuticals and different vitamin and minerals, turmeric is a great one to add in if you're not taking that today. And then looking back at whole food sources, right? So low inflammatory diet. This is something that you can work with your nutritionist, your coach, and start incorporating more low inflammatory foods and start identifying some of your inflammatory triggers and pulling those out. Now, one way to do this also, before I talk about which foods that I'll recommend, is schedule an HTMA test. If you go back and look at one of our prior episodes on Peak Physique Podcast, one of our Team Adams partners, Dr. Indy Vasquez, right? She's the DNM, Doctor of Natural Medicine. You can schedule an HTMA test with her, and you have a hair tissue mineral analysis, which is going to reveal some of these things that are happening in the body down to the cellular level. And things like inflammation can be identified through this test, and also what your triggers are. So we talked about cortisol, right? So if you have high cortisol, if you have a histamine intolerance and a very strong histamine response, it's going to tell you certain foods to avoid, as well as your blood oxidation type. And then we can recalibrate and align your macronutrition around those food choices and start to pull out the ones that are triggering the inflammation in the first place. So highly recommend doing the HTMAs. Other low inflammatory diet recommendations would be, again, foods that are rich in omega-3s, EPAs, and DHAs, right? All your healthy fats. Some whole food sources for that would be things like, again, nuts, seeds, avocados, extra virgin olive oil, and then certain types of fish like salmon, right? The fish oils, things that are high or rich in omega-3s. Another great one that a lot of people like to incorporate would be probiotic yogurt. Also has been shown to lower CRP levels directly and assist with gut inflammation. So make sure you're getting that probiotic yogurt. There's some really good ones out there that are high in protein that, don't have the added sugars in. That's going to be a great one to add in, especially if you have high amounts of inflammation. This will help balance your water out. And then again, with the histamine intolerance, you want to align with a low histamine diet and add more vitamin B6. This is another great one that will help to increase an enzyme called DAO enzyme, which is an antagonist to histamine. So this can help lower some of that response and hopefully lower some of that chronic inflammation that could be triggered through your diet. And if you need additional information or, you want to go a little bit deeper with this stuff, I'm always available. You guys can email me directly, and I would be more than happy to send you some follow-up information. Guys, that's all we have right now on inflammation markers for physique athletes. I want you guys to, again, take away some of this, start thinking about how you can reduce that inflammation and hopefully improve your physique outcomes. And you can catch me on Instagram at AndreAdams_official. Email me at trainingbydre@gmail.com. And we will see you next time on another episode of the Peak Physique Podcast.